Normally when I come to a place to give a talk and put on my fancy clothes like this, it's to researchers, and the talks I give are normally focused on standard errors and p-values and methodological things, which many of the researchers in the room are, I'm sure, very familiar with. This is a unique opportunity for me to talk about the ways in which we can use our research to inform policy and to inform practice. And it's really pushed me to think about this really critically. As a researcher, what voice should I give that can help inform those who go and make decisions that are going to directly impact the lives of young kids? So what I hope to do today is to talk about what we know from research, what research says about access to high quality education. So access to high quality education is a ubiquitous term. Everybody says access to high quality education at all levels of policy, at all levels of decision making. So, as you can read on the White House website, expanding access to high-quality early education is among the smartest investments that we can make. On the National Governors Association website, studies find that when children have access to quality early childhood education programs, they have an opportunity to develop the cognitive, physical, and social competencies that serves as the foundation for success in kindergarten. Similarly, the U.S. Conference of Mayors makes similar statements. They have a document called Increase Access to High-Quality Early Childhood Education Programs. So what I want to do today is break the term access to high-quality early education into its two component parts: access to early childhood education and high-quality early childhood education. Because frankly, we don't really do research on access to high-quality early childhood education. There are some studies that look at access to early childhood education and then try to slice it into high and low quality, but otherwise these are very distinct ways in which we're addressing distinct research questions, distinct research methods. So what I hope to do is break that down. So we all think about early childhood education as achieving a certain promise, that it's going to promote the well-being of children and families, that it's going to reduce achievement gaps that among the top 10% and the bottom 10% in terms of economic income, that gap has widened greatly. It's doubled over the last 70 years. We see early childhood education as producing economic benefits to society. And there's at least 50 years of research that has gone on the topic of access to and quality of early childhood education. So the overview of what I want to talk about today is to talk about what research says about access to early childhood education. I'll talk about the research questions, the methodologies we use. I'll highlight some of my favorite studies that I'm sure all of you all are familiar with. And then I'll draw together some conclusions related to access. The second section is what research, and then I need to introduce theories. What theories say what is high quality early childhood education? And then lastly, to help us move forward, so we're not just looking back at prior research, but looking forward in terms of what we can do, I'd like to try to distill some implications from this research, from these theories, for how we go about moving forward, basically to achieve the promise of early childhood education in terms of reducing achievement gaps, making a more equitable and just society, having kids be more ready to learn, and benefiting in the ways that the economic analysis can tell you that we do. So the goals, this is quite an intro, isn't it? The goals are to increase familiarity with the research and theories. I want to just, again, distinguish between what research says about access to and quality of early childhood education. I want to define early childhood education, and I want to do this from a child's perspective. And then lastly, I want to talk about what strategies can we do to move forward to achieve this promise of early childhood education. So section 1, what research says about access. The primary research question that people who are involved in studying access to early childhood education address is, does offering children access to these programs have a positive impact on the children, on their families, on their communities? And the types of research methods that we use compare groups of children who are offered access and those who are not. So these oftentimes are experimental designs where we have a list of kids who want to enroll in a program. We probably have a wait list. Not all kids can be served, so we do the lottery. We conduct the experiment and we randomly assign some kids to the program and other kids to not to the program. And then we look at differences down the road to see what the impacts of access are. There's also another interesting method that's been used more recently in the study of early childhood, access to early childhood education, called regression discontinuity. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I won't get into it right now, but as another method to determine the impacts of access. And when we think about these studies of access to early childhood education, they've really been conducted in 3 different settings. We have the model preschool programs, the Abecedarian, the Chicago Parent Child Center, the High Scope Perry Preschool that you guys I know are familiar with. We have studies of state-funded pre-K programs, often using the regression discontinuity design. And then we have studies of Head Start that you guys are probably familiar with. And what I want to do now is just sort of walk through some of my favorite studies, just so that when we talk about the evidence base for access to early childhood education, you guys know the citations, you guys know what the abstracts look like for these research studies. And I hope that you guys take advantage of these and further read the interesting findings that have come about from these studies. So studies of access to model early childhood programs. So the Perry Preschool program and the Abecedarian program I will highlight. These are randomized controlled trials. These are experimental studies. The Perry Preschool program itself started in 1962, and the Abecedarian was in 1972. Perry was in Ypsilanti, Michigan, and Abecedarian was in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. The program served different groups of kids. So the Perry Preschool program served 3 to 4-year-old kids, while the Abecedarian program served kids from the age of 6 months until 5 years old. And the Abecedarian program was a full year-round program, 50 hours a week, 50 weeks a year for this duration of basically the kids' first 5 years of life. The Perry Preschool program is much more of a typical sort of early childhood pre-K program, serving 3 and 4-year-old kids. It's a half-day program that occurred during the academic year. This is the cost-benefit stuff. This is what everybody refers to when we talk about $3 return for our investment for every $1, $16 return for every $1. And as you can see, the cost of these programs are on the slide. The benefits of these programs are also on the slide. And the economic benefits, keep in mind, of these programs are returned from things like greater earnings for those kids that were randomly assigned to the program, more likely to be graduates from high school, less likely to be arrested, more likely to be employed, more likely to have enrolled in higher education. So I want to give you guys a summary of this. A nice place to go look at a summary of this study is the special issue of Science Magazine that came out in fall, I think it was November of 2011. And there's just a great overview of what we know about the current state of early childhood education, and there's a nice summary of these cost-benefit studies there. All right, so now this is the regression discontinuity design. How many people are familiar with regression discontinuity? Okay, some hands in here. It's a very clever design. Okay, so let me see if I can talk this out here. Okay, so let's imagine it's September 1st of this past year, okay? So there's a bunch of kids who are entering kindergarten. And let's just talk about these kids over here. These guys have just entered kindergarten. And we have a child who was born September 1st, meaning that they're the youngest child in their class. They just enrolled in kindergarten. And what we have also is kids who are all across the 5-year-old age spectrum, right? And so what we can do for these kids who have just entered kindergarten is come up with a best fitting line that looks at age over here and how they did on some sort of test, right? And so what we do is we get this line, and from the line we can get an estimated score of that kid right there, the youngest kid who just started kindergarten. Okay, let's move over to this side of the line right here. These kids are in pre-K. They just started pre-K, okay? We're going to test them at exactly the same time. They're in pre-K classrooms that the kindergarten kids over here just came from. And what we do is we give these guys a test right here, and we have an estimated score. We have a line that we compute, and we have an estimated score for these guys right here, right? The only difference between the oldest kid in pre-K right here and the youngest kid in kindergarten right here is, well, 2 things. 1 day of life, which really probably doesn't make that much of a difference, and whether the kid attended pre-K. These guys over here are above the cutoff. They attended pre-K the year before. So what we can do is look at the difference in scores between this estimated child over here and this estimated child right here as a way to determine the impact of having gone through pre-K. So this method was popularized by Bill Gormley and his colleagues at Georgetown University studying the Tulsa pre-K program, the Oklahoma Universal Pre-K program. They looked at Tulsa, and what they did is basically use this regression discontinuity method, and what they found is that there were large and substantial differences between those 2 groups that we're comparing that they attribute to having gone to, they attribute to the pre-K program. The magnitude of these differences are quite large. A 0.79 standard deviation difference between the treatment and the control group In economically and educationally meaningful terms, point 2 is what we think of as being educationally meaningful. This is a very large effect on letter word identification, a large effect on spelling, and a more moderate effect on math. But consistently across these outcomes, what we find is an impact of having gone through pre-K using this regression discontinuity method. This was published in Developmental Psychology in 2005. So I love this study, and for some reason, nobody talks about this study. This study uses a regression discontinuity design in a very clever way. So when Head Start was rolled out in 1965, the way in which communities were decided as to whether they would get a Head Start program or not was based upon their applying, right, to get the funding. What the federal government did is that they sent to the 300 most economically disadvantaged communities a technical assistant to help write the grant. And so what you have is the 300 most economically disadvantaged communities have a technical assistant who helps write the grant, and these communities were very, very likely to have received funding because of this assistant. What you also have is, communities that are number 301 and 302, and they're not that different in terms of the economic needs that this community has. One difference, though, is they didn't get the technical assistance, and another difference is that they were very unlikely to get the Head Start program in those communities. So what Jens Ludwig and Doug Miller did is they took those 300 communities, and then they took the 300 below the threshold and the 300 above the threshold, basically did a very similar method of analysis, and compared the mortality rates of young children on things that you could probably prevent by having gone through Head Start. Things like tuberculosis, whooping cough, strep throat, measles, nutritional deficiencies, meningitis, acute bronchitis, pneumonia, influenza, emphysema, and asthma. And what they did is looked at community-level mortality rates of young children in the 300 communities that got the program compared to the 300 communities above the threshold that didn't get the program, or at least didn't get the technical assistance to attempt to get the program. And what they found is that there were differences in the rates of mortality due to preventable illnesses that were prevented, in this case, by the creation of a Head Start program. This is a statement that Head Start saved lives when you look back in the 1960s and you link this to mortality rates. Similarly, what they went on to do is to link it with educational attainment years later in these communities, thinking that these are now adults, and what was the impact if we compare the 300 below and above the threshold. And what you find is similarly, there's some challenges with the data and linking it to a prospective study 25 years later. And what they have is some suggestive evidence that there are statistically significant differences in the educational attainment of the people from these 300 communities that were served compared to those who were not. Such a clever study. So I think it's published by a publisher that many university libraries don't have access to. So it took a little wrangling for me to find this, but I would encourage you all to take a look at this. It's also published by the National Bureau of Economic Research, that's easier to access. The Head Start Impact Study. How many people are familiar with the Head Start Impact Study? Great. Okay, so this is an experimental study, randomized controlled trial. Basically using experimental methods, they went to Head Start centers that had a wait list, that were oversubscribed. And what they did is they did random assignment of kids either into the program, providing access to the program, or not to have access to this program. Let me tell you what that actually means. Just because you were provided access to the program does not mean you went to the program. There's a number of students, a number of kids who were provided access who didn't go. Similarly, and I think really importantly, in the control group, those who were randomized out of a particular Head Start program, that doesn't mean they didn't get any treatment. That doesn't mean they didn't go to Head Start. They might have gone to the Head Start down the road. They might have gone to a state-funded pre-K program. This study was 2003, 2004, where state programs were now more widely available than in the past experimental studies. And so that's who we're comparing. It's access to the program. It's among a cohort of 4-year-olds who are randomly assigned in centers, and among a cohort of 3-year-olds. The study itself had 5,000 kids, about half split between the 3-year-old cohort and the 4-year-old cohort. When you look at the differences on cognitive outcomes, as I'm showing you right here from the 2012 report, what you find is across a number of different cognitive outcomes, you find statistically significant differences in favor of those kids who were offered access to the program at the end of the Head Start year on things like color identification, letter naming, letter word identification, spelling, pre-academic skills. So here what we find, even when we're comparing some kids who went through Head Start and some kids who didn't go through Head Start, in a RCT methodology where we're just looking at the impacts of random assignment, impacts of offering access, what we find is across a number of cognitive outcomes, statistical differences in favor of those kids who were given access to the program. So here are the conclusions, and I cite Hiro and Christina Weiland, who have put together a document that a number of researchers, over 500 researchers, have endorsed. Statements such as policymakers debate investing in quality early childhood education programs, they should note the widespread agreement among researchers about the value of such programs. And let me tell you, as a researcher, there are very few things that we can say definitively. It's always, yeah, but, generalizability, what about these other threats to internal validity? This is something that 500 researchers in this field have been able to stand up and say conclusively, based upon the prior evidence that was just supported, and other studies that I'm not covering, I just hit on my favorite ones, that there's a strong endorsement, a consensus among these researchers around the value of quality early childhood education. So let me move on now to the next topic, which is what does research say about high quality early childhood education? So let's talk about quality of early childhood education. One of the primary research questions that we look at is, to what extent does the quality of early childhood education relate to children's development and learning during the early childhood years? So does higher quality early childhood education have a positive impact on children's development? This has been the topic of numerous studies over the last 30 and 40 years, the quality to outcomes association. A second research question that I'll also talk about is, well, what the heck do we really mean by high quality early childhood education in the first place? This is more informed by what theorists say young children need, but I'll talk about some of those theories. And then a third research question that many of us are engaged with is, what sort of strategies, how can we go about promoting high quality early childhood education and children's development? So I'm going to talk in brief about each of these three topics. So the first question, does higher quality early childhood education have a positive impact on children's development? One would think that if we're going to call it high quality, it should be related to kids' learning and development, right? A different methodology here than what we talked about in terms of access to early childhood education. Access to is an RCT, a randomized control trial, or a regression discontinuity design, where we walk away from that study feeling pretty confident that the effect that we're finding, the differences on kids' outcomes, are caused by the program itself. Here what we're doing is correlational studies. All of these kids are in an early childhood education program. All of these kids were studying their development. And so we're looking at the associations from among all kids in these programs, the correlations between, regressions accounting for the researchers, accounting for all the kind of stuff that we can account for, but we're examining in a correlational way the associations between quality and outcomes. There's a number of challenges to this research. For one, it gets to the next question that we'll talk about. What is high quality early childhood education? Across these studies, there are so many different ways that researchers have gone about defining and measuring high quality early childhood education. A second challenge with this research is the error that comes about in measuring these things. Maybe you can define what a high quality early childhood education program is. How confidently can you come up with a score that reflects that program? Similarly, has anybody done assessments with 4- and 5-year-old kids? The quality of information you get from these kids while you're assessing them certainly can be questioned, and there's other sources of information in those scores that may have nothing to do with the kid's ability on a language assessment, a literacy assessment, etc. And then lastly, and there's many more limitations, I'm sure, the correlational methodology. One of the challenges that we have in these findings is it really the quality caused the kid to develop, or is there a selection issue going on where kids who are more likely to develop at a certain rate are selecting in to certain levels of quality programs? We're not really sure which direction the arrow goes. I mean, we can do our best to control for some of these things, but this will always be, there's potential biases and confounds in some of these results. That being said, what we can conclude across tons and tons of studies is that no matter how we measure early childhood quality or children's development, generally across a number of studies, but not consistently. There are some examples where quality isn't related to outcomes, but generally what we find is that higher quality is positively associated with children's outcomes. But what we also find is that association between quality and development depends upon a lot of things. For one, it can depend upon the characteristics of the children that we're talking about. one thing that we like to say, and it's true in many studies, is that higher quality has a stronger benefit for kids who experience greater economic risks. You can also say the exact opposite from other studies. Higher quality has a stronger benefit for kids who have fewer risks. Thereby, they're able to better capitalize on the resources and opportunities of a higher quality program, and it has a differentially more positive benefit for those guys compared to the less privileged kids. Another thing that relates to the effects that we find in terms of quality and outcomes is what sort of developmental outcomes are we studying? And then lastly, and I want to talk a little bit more about this now, is one of the key things that determines the effects that we find in looking at the association between quality and outcomes is how we're measuring quality in the first place. So let me talk a little bit about a measure of a study that Laura referred to, looking at the association between quality and outcomes. And let me tell you what we did. We took a policymaker's view of quality on one hand. And what we did is we looked at how policymakers define and measure a high quality program. And what they say they talk about regulatable things, like we need to have teachers who have a bachelor's degree. We need to have teachers who have a field of have studied early childhood education or child development. We need class sizes of 20 or smaller. We need child-to-teacher ratios of 10 to 1 or better. We need meals served. We need 15 hours of professional development or more. This is the way we can quantify, from a regulatory perspective, the quality of a program. And so what we did for 671 different classrooms in this study is we came up with a score on a 0 to 9 scale of how many of these benchmarks of quality, structural quality, were achieved in each of these classrooms. And we looked to see whether better quality in that definition was more strongly related to kids' learning and development. The second way that we measured quality is we went into the classrooms and we observed what was happening. And we used a measure called the Classroom Assessment Scoring System to measure the quality of the emotional support in the classroom. To what extent was it a positive climate for kids? To what extent was there negativity in there? Were teachers sensitive to kids' needs? How much regard was there for the students' perspective themselves? So we have a measure of the emotional support provided to young kids in those settings. We also have a measure of the instructional supports. What were the questions and answers like? How did the teacher give feedback to kids? How frequently was she talking to kids? What kind of language was she using with kids? This is what we call instructional quality. So we're looking at the second way of measuring quality from a process perspective, from what kids are directly experiencing in these settings. And probably not surprising to many of you, what we found is that when you look at the structural index from 0 to 9, what you found is that achieving more indicators of quality from that definition was not related to the extent to which children learned and developed into those programs. On the other hand, when you look at what kids directly experience in these classrooms, the ways teachers are interacting with these kids, what you find is that more instructionally rich environments were positively associated with kids' language development, with kids' math development, with kids' literacy development. More emotionally supportive environments were positively related to kids' social development and reduction in problem behaviors. I think this is probably common sense at this point, but I think it's important to disambiguate quality and think about it from these two perspectives, at least from these two perspectives, from the policymaker's perspective, from the classroom perspective. And now what I want to try to do is think about it from the child's perspective. I'm not going to go with this. Okay, so what is quality of early childhood education? Let's think about this from a child's perspective. And I'm going to completely oversimplify some incredibly interesting and complicated theories of human development for the sake of making this point. So if you think about any given child, and let's when we talk about a perspective, let's think about a child's perspective. And let's think about it a perspective of a child you know. Because I think there are some universal things across all the kids that are popping into your minds right now. And that's things like, what this kid needs is to feel safe, loved, and supported. You can look at attachment theories to help make that argument. What kids need are experiences that are well organized and predictable. Those people who study kids' self-regulation would tell you that that's an important component of kids regulating their attention and their focus and their emotions. And then people like Vygotsky would say things like, well, kids need learning activities that are developmentally attuned, the zone of proximal development. What kids know, what you need to do is work with what they know and extend it a little bit. and push them within the zone that they're able to learn something new. Something below what they know isn't going to be effective. Something way beyond what they're going to know is not effective. What you need to do is scaffold new knowledge. So those are some developmental ideas around what all kids need to promote their learning and development. So what we do when we think about access to early childhood education is we create a bubble. Access creates this space, the early childhood classroom. And when we create this space, what we have following from access is some potential, some opportunity for the child to have frequent interactions with other people. So we create the space, we populate it with other people, and we create an opportunity for the child to interact with these other people. The teacher, these guys. I should say that my daughter drew the nice one, and I drew the What we also create is opportunities for kids to interact not just with other people, but with stuff, with books, with glue, with scissors, with crayons, with pencils. Okay? And so this is probably the main point that I want to make from anything I'm going to say right now. When you think about what a child needs to develop within an early childhood education classroom, are interactions, frequent interactions with other people, and with learning materials that fulfill those basic developmental needs, that are warm and supportive, that are organized and predictable, and that are developmentally attuned, that are appropriate for her ability. Okay. Does that make sense? So to the extent that we want to talk about high quality early childhood education, I think we should be talking about those things that we know to be directly related to children's development and learning. And those are the interactions that a child experiences on a day-to-day, moment-to-moment basis that fulfill those developmental needs that I just described. And I want to get even more specific than that. I want us to think not just to call it interactions and not just call it emotional support and instructional support and things well organized. I want to give a bunch more verbs here. This is a high quality program. And I'm going to read all of these because I think it's important to say all of them, even though there's probably a million more that you could come up with. It is expressing, comforting, planning, playing, responding, creating, talking, describing, cooperating, building, writing, hinting, cheering, smiling, coloring, solving, encouraging, showing, singing, choosing, integrating, focusing, engaging, what is it? Observing, sharing, thank you. Wow. It is big like that, isn't it? Deciding, helping, expressing, listening, laughing, exploring, asking, explaining, deciding, discovering, supporting, expanding. So again, this is sort of the punchline to all this. These interactions are the processes through which early childhood education promotes well-being, reduces achievement gaps, and produces economic benefits. We can afford access. We can create the spaces. We can add the people. We can put the stuff in there. These are the mechanisms by which creating access is going to actually help us deliver on the promise of early childhood education. So what are the implications of this research and these theories? Well, one implication is we should expand access to early childhood education, right? And as this figure shows you, we've done that. If you look across the 40-year period here, this comes from it's a census survey. If you look at the percentage of 3-, 4-, and 5-year-old kids who attend an early childhood education program, what you find is a sharp increase across these 40 years, to the point where in 2005, it looks like there's roughly 60% of kids who are going to an early childhood education program. If you look nationally at this access to early childhood, this comes from the 2011 report from the National Institute of Early Education Research. I picked the 2011 one because during this time they also included an estimate of the number of kids, the percentage of kids who went through private pre-K programs. Since then they've stopped that, I'm guessing because it's probably a very difficult thing to estimate. But according to these figures, in 2011, about 50% of 3-year-olds were enrolled in an early childhood education program, and about 75% of 4-year-olds are enrolled in an early childhood education program of some sort, publicly funded like Head Start or a state pre-K program, or private programs that parents are paying for. I want to show you from the 2013 report where Ohio stands in terms of access to early childhood education. So in 2013, 1% of 3-year-olds and 2% of 4-year-olds were served by publicly funded programs in the state of Ohio. Of the 40 states that offer state-funded pre-K programs, Ohio ranks 39. I come from a state that's not all too different than this in Oregon. I also used to live in Georgia and study that pre-K program, which is a universal pre-K program, and 60 to 70% of all 4-year-olds attend that program. It's universal. It doesn't matter what your family's economic background is. And there's Head Start there, so another 15% attend there. So you look at certain states that have been able to create universal pre-K programs, what you find is 75, 85, 95% of 4-year-old kids having an early childhood experience before they enter kindergarten. So here's the last thing I want to talk about. So what the heck can we do about it? We can talk about what research says. We can talk about what theories say. What should we do? What are the strategies that we should implement that are going to be effective in improving the quality of early childhood education and thereby improving children's development? So I want to talk here a little bit, get us back to our figure around what Access did here. It created the bubble, it filled it with people and stuff. Access also creates the systems of support. And I feel like all of us are part of a system of support in some way. We're not the ones in those classrooms, unless some of you are early childhood educators. We're people outside of those classrooms, but still have the same goal and focus as the teachers do. What we want is to improve the well-being and lives of these young kids. And so we sit outside of this bubble. And these are people, these are policymakers, these are researchers, these are program administrators, these are community members, these are philanthropic organizations and foundations. We sit outside of this bubble. And we want to improve the kids that are inside of this bubble. That's us, by the way. And this is the space that we have to work. This is the overlap between them. This is the way in which we can do things that are going to have a difference in the lives of those kids and teachers that are in that bubble of the classroom. That's where the action is, right? So what do we do about it? Let me just show you a menu of things that people choose from in order to create opportunities that are going to improve the interactions that kids experience. So one mechanism is policies. We can say we need to improve teacher credentials. We need to have a certain level of education or type of training in early childhood education. Small class sizes, the structural components that we have talked about previously. Pre-service training. What we should do is really focus on colleges and universities and think about ways that we can enrich the experiences of soon-to-be teachers such that when they enter these classrooms for their jobs, they're able to provide those interactions that are going to help kids learn and develop. Teacher training and professional development. This is something, there's a huge industry around this. What we do is have people come to workshops, which as Hiro mentioned yesterday, those are not effective, and yet we're still kind of doing a workshop here. One doesn't learn that much from these opportunities. Workshops. We create learning communities where teachers can come together with themselves and with experts to discuss some of their issues with teaching. There's mentoring and coaching and consultation and counseling programs for teachers to help improve their interactions. We also have curricula. There's all kinds of comprehensive curricula out there that many of you probably are very familiar with. There's also the curricular supplements. We want kids to learn specific literacy skills. Why don't we have teachers implement this program? If we want kids to learn specific self-regulation skills, why don't we have teachers implement these types of activities? And then lastly, there's there's probably many more examples, but another example is the quality rating and improvement systems, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. What we do in QRISs, which I absolutely love the premise of, is you go into a classroom and you observe what's going on. And you rate the quality of things like the interactions that a child and children in that classroom are experiencing. And then what you do is you provide opportunities to improve those specific dimensions and aspects of quality that were rated low. And then you go back and then you rate it again, and hopefully you see an increase in the quality of what kids are directly experiencing in these programs. Okay, so given that we have a menu of choices of what we can do to improve kids' experiences, and given that the space that we have to work within are those stars, there's a few things that I would suggest that we do as we move forward in maximizing the benefits of early childhood education from us who are sitting outside of this bubble and are part of the systems of support. The first thing, and this is really, again, the main point I want to make here, nothing that we do is going to make a difference unless it improves a child's direct, day-to-day, moment-to-moment interactions that they experience in a classroom. And we can talk about all the things that we do, but until you have demonstrable evidence that it's improved the way kids are being supported, instructionally and emotionally, it's not going to make a difference. Secondly, we need to be responsive to the interests and needs of those who we're working with, those who we're trying to help, particularly the teachers. So many of us who go to Institute for Education Sciences to try to get grant funding, the US Department of Education, the funding structure has actually changed. The competitions have changed somewhat. And it's no longer about rigor and the experiment. Well, there's still a place for and still opportunities for experimental studies, but now it's about researchers being partners and working with local education agencies and using research to understand through their data what the problems are based upon data analysis, and to use research and our knowledge around what the different solutions are to those problems, where we can then show them a menu like this and have them pick out the solution that is most appropriate for the interests and needs of those participating. And I talk about that more from a system level, a lead education agency level, but unless the teacher is invested in this, the teacher is the best chance we have to make a difference in those interactions. We need to be responsive to the needs and interests of those teachers. And I've never been an early childhood educator, but I'm a parent, and I'm sure when you have 20 of these little kids running around, it is an incredibly stressful position. And so being sensitive to the stresses of the educators, focusing on empowering them to feel like they can go and do what they know is best for their young kids because they're the ones who are there every day. I think those are some of the solutions we need to think about. We also need to think about caring for the caregivers. There's a project that I'm currently working on that's focusing on the mindfulness of early childhood educators so that they can better mitigate the stress that they have in their jobs. It's not to try to get a kid to know more letters. It's trying to get a teacher to be more calm, to be more aware, to be more clear in her interactions with young kids as a result of taking care of her own health and well-being first. A third one is scalability, and I look to Laura over there who created the Read It Again program, which was created with scalability in mind. Oftentimes we create these things in our laboratory and then we plunk them into a setting and teachers don't implement it like we want them to. We don't show effects like we thought we would. And then we go back and say, well, you didn't do it right. Well, what we need to do is develop things that can be used for a large number of people, that can be widely disseminated. And what you need to do is work with partners to create those solutions. So when you think about Appalachian preschools, like this program that Laura created, what we're talking about is low-resourced environments. What we're talking about is not much technology in those spaces. What we need is low-cost solutions to a major problem, which is literacy levels of kids from economically disadvantaged places, particularly in Appalachia. And so what Laura did over a 3-year developmental process was create a solution to that problem in which she and other researchers worked with policymakers in West Virginia that is in the heart of Appalachia to create a literacy program that would work there. And it's free. And it costs, you pay $100 for books, and those will last you for as long as you keep the books. And it's a sequenced program to deliver literacy instruction in these communities where you can't afford the $5,000 literacy coach. The last point I want to make, and this one is really just opening up a conversation that we could follow up on as we have question and answers. But what we need to recognize, and I'm sure you all do, is that we've got a classroom. We've got this little microsystem of the classroom over here, and we've got these systems that help support those classrooms. But what happens is that these kids move from early childhood education, at least from pre-K, into the K-12 system and into the K-12 classrooms. This is a transition. It's a move where all of a sudden now things are way different in the mind of that kid. The classrooms are different. The demands on the child are very different. The focus on doing well on your state test becomes primary. The systems of support are different. And so what we have is, it's not a hidden secret in early childhood education, but it goes back to what I showed you with the Head Start impact study, is we do a good job of creating short-term impacts of what we're doing with young kids that oftentimes diminish as the kids progress down the road. And that diminishing can be the result of many explanations, many hypotheses around why the effects of our investments in early childhood education are not maintained. One hypothesis that we really need to think about is the alignment across systems so that the kids' experiences from one setting like pre-K into a kindergarten setting are easy, so that they get there and they know what to expect. Things are predictable. Their needs are being supported emotionally. That the instruction that they're receiving is appropriate for their ability, maybe because the pre-K teacher has talked to the kindergarten teacher before the kid gets there. So again, I'm oversimplifying the problem and I'm oversimplifying the solution, but I just want to highlight that the maintenance, the question we should be asking ourselves, yes, access to, yes, quality of, it's about maintenance of, the long-term impacts of our early investment in kids. My last slide, so conclusions. Definitively, providing access to early childhood education promotes well-being, reduces achievement gaps, and produces economic benefits. That's what the access to story is. The definition of high-quality early childhood education from a child's perspective is the frequent interactions that they have with other people, with learning materials that are warm and supportive, organized and predictable, and developmentally attuned. And then finally, for us who are sitting outside of the classroom, for our efforts to actually have a benefit to the young kids that we want to help, our efforts need to first and foremost improve what kids directly experience in these classrooms. Our efforts need to be responsive to the interests and needs, particularly of the teachers we're working with. Our solutions need to be scalable, and finally, things need to be aligned across classrooms as they progress over time.